Welcome to Chapter 6, the fifth and final pillar of DORA, information sharing. And I find this pillar refreshingly different from the others. Where the rest of DORA is mostly about obligations and requirements, this one is largely about collaboration. It's the idea that in cybersecurity, we're genuinely stronger together than apart. Let me set the scene for what we'll explore. Here's our path. We'll start with the legal foundation, Article 45, which permits and encourages threat information sharing. And we'll see what you can actually share and the conditions involved. Then we'll meet the real-world networks that make this happen, the ISACs, FS-ISAC, and EU bodies like ENISA and CERT-EU. Next, we'll navigate the tricky constraints, confidentiality, GDPR, when personal data is involved, and competition law. Because sharing has limits you must respect. Then we get practical, building internal processes to both consume incoming intelligence and contribute outgoing intelligence safely. And finally, we'll weave information sharing into your broader resilience strategy and board reporting. By the end, you'll see sharing not as a chore, but as a collective shield. Let's dive in. Let's begin with the legal heart of this pillar, Article 45. And right away, I want to highlight something interesting about its tone, because it's quite different from the rest of DORA. Most of the regulation says you must. Article 45 essentially says you may, and we'd encourage you to. It's about permission, not obligation. Let me unpack what that means. Here's the core. Article 45 permits and actively encourages financial entities to share cyber threat information among themselves. Why does this even need a law to permit it? Because historically, firms were often nervous about sharing, worried about legal risk, confidentiality, or competition concerns. Article 45 gives them a clear green light saying, yes, you're allowed to do this and we think you should. But notice the word encourage, not require. Sharing under Article 45 is voluntary. You're not forced into it. However, when you do share, it must happen within defined safeguards, protecting confidentiality and personal data. There are limits. You can't share recklessly. Let me give you an analogy. Think of a neighborhood watch scheme. The law doesn't force you to join, but the community strongly encourages it because everyone's safer when neighbors look out for each other. Article 45 creates that same spirit for cyber threats in finance. So my advice, don't view Article 45 as just another box to tick. See it as an invitation to strengthen the whole sector, including yourself. And remember, you must notify authorities of your participation. We'll explore exactly what and how you can share next. But the foundation is this: sharing is permitted, encouraged, and genuinely valuable. So Article 45 says you can share threat information. But that naturally raises the question, share what exactly? You can't just dump everything you know into a group chat. There are sensible boundaries around what's useful and appropriate to share. Let me help you understand what belongs in the sharing bucket and what doesn't. The kind of information DORA envisions sharing is cyber threat intelligence, the useful, defensive stuff. We're talking about threat indicators, the digital fingerprints of attacks, tactics, techniques, and procedures, how attackers actually operate, security alerts, and insights about detection or configuration that help others defend themselves. In short, information that genuinely improves collective detection and defense. But, and this is key, this sharing happens within trusted communities and under defined conditions, and it explicitly excludes anything that would breach confidentiality or break the law. So you're not sharing your customers' personal data or your secret business plans. You're sharing the threat knowledge that helps everyone build better walls. Let me make it concrete. Imagine you spot a new phishing campaign targeting your staff using a particular fake domain and a specific lure. Sharing that, watch out for this phishing pattern, here's the malicious domain, is hugely valuable to peers and harms no one. That's the sweet spot. So my advice? Focus your sharing on the actionable defensive intelligence that strengthens the community. Ask yourself, does this help others defend without exposing anything sensitive? If yes, it's likely good to share. Keep it useful, keep it safe, and keep it within trusted circles. That's the art of good information sharing. Now let's talk about doing this properly, because sharing threat intelligence isn't a casual free-for-all affair. To share safely and compliantly, you operate within structured arrangements that meet certain minimum requirements. Think of it as setting the ground rules before joining the club. Let me walk you through what those requirements involve. First and foremost, any sharing arrangement must protect sensitive and personal data. This is non-negotiable. The whole point is to share threat intelligence, not to accidentally leak confidential information or breach privacy. So the arrangement needs safeguards built in from the start. Then, the arrangement should clearly define its membership, who's in the trusted circle, its purpose, what it's for, and the rules of participation, how members are expected to behave. This clarity matters. You need to know who you're sharing with and trust that they'll handle the information responsibly. Crucially, the arrangement must ensure that shared information stays within the trusted group. Intelligence shared in confidence shouldn't leak out to the wider world. And throughout, it maintains confidentiality and lawful processing. Let me use an analogy. Think of a professional support group where members agree to confidentiality before sharing personal struggles. There's an understanding. What's shared here stays here, and everyone's vetted and committed to the rules. That trust framework is exactly what makes honest sharing possible. So my advice, before joining or creating a sharing arrangement, make sure these foundations are solid: clear membership, defined purpose, strong safeguards, and confidentiality. And document the arrangement properly for accountability. Good structure is what lets you share boldly while staying safe. Let's cover a small but important administrative step that's easy to overlook: notifying the authorities when you participate in information sharing arrangements. It's not the most thrilling topic, I'll admit, but skipping it is exactly the kind of small miss that creates problems. So let me explain what's required and why it matters. Here's the requirement, plain and simple. When your firm joins an information sharing arrangement, you need to notify your competent authority. It's a way of keeping the regulator in the loop about your participation in these collaborative threat sharing efforts. Why does the regulator want to know? A few reasons. It supports their supervisory awareness. They get a picture of how the sector is collaborating on threats. It also helps them understand the information sharing landscape, who's connected to whom. And it keeps your participation transparent and above board. And it's not just a one-time thing. You should update the authorities on any changes to your participation if you join new arrangements or leave existing ones. Keeping records of these notifications is good practice too. Think of it like registering for a club that has some regulatory relevance. You let the relevant body know you've joined, and you tell them if your status changes. It's a simple courtesy that keeps everything transparent. So my advice, build this notification step into your governance process around information sharing. Make it part of the standard workflow when you join or leave an arrangement so it never gets forgotten. Align your participation decisions with your internal governance. It's a small administrative habit, but it keeps you cleanly compliant and your regulator appropriately informed. Don't let this little step trip you up. Let's get concrete now and meet the real-world vehicles that make threat sharing happen, the ISACs and especially FS-ISAC. Because Article 45 gives you permission to share, but these organizations are where the actual sharing takes place, day in, day out. Let me introduce you to this world. ISAC stands for Information Sharing and Analysis Center. These are trusted communities organized by sector where members exchange threat intelligence. The idea is beautifully simple. Organizations in the same industry face similar threats, so why not pool their knowledge and defend together? FS-ISAC is the one specifically for the financial sector, and it operates globally. So what actually happens inside? Members exchange alerts about emerging threats, share indicators of attacks, swap best practices, and warn each other about active campaigns. When one member spots a new attack, they can alert thousands of others who can then defend proactively. It dramatically accelerates how fast the whole sector detects and responds to threats. Let me give you a real flavor. Imagine a new malware strain starts hitting banks in one region. A member spots it, analyzes it, and shares the details through FS-ISAC. Within hours, banks across the globe know what to look for and have updated their defenses. That's collective security in action, and it's genuinely powerful. So, my advice, if you're a financial entity, seriously consider your participation in relevant ISACs. And here's a DORA specific tip. Map your existing network memberships against DORA's sharing expectations. You might already be part of these communities, or you might find valuable gaps to fill. Either way, these networks turn the principle of sharing into practical, real-time defense. Let's broaden our view to the European level, because beyond industry groups like FS-ISAC, there's a whole ecosystem of EU bodies that strengthen cyber collaboration. Understanding these helps you see the bigger picture of how Europe coordinates against cyber threats. Let me introduce the key players and their roles. First, ENISA, the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. Think of ENISA as the EU's cybersecurity brain trust, supporting strategy, providing guidance, and helping raise the overall level of cyber resilience across Europe. When you want authoritative European cyber guidance, ENISA is a go-to source. Then there's CERT-EU, the Computer Emergency Response Team for the EU institutions. They coordinate cyber response, particularly for EU institutions and bodies, acting as a hub for handling and sharing information about incidents and threats. And we've met Tiber EU already, back in Chapter 4. Remember, it underpins coordinated threat-led testing across the EU. It also plays a role in the broader collaborative landscape, fostering a common approach to resilience testing. How do these connect for you? Together, these bodies strengthen cross-border collaboration, creating a more unified European front against cyber threats. They set standards, share intelligence, and coordinate responses that no single firm or country could manage alone. Let me frame it with an analogy. Think of these as the regional and national coordination centers in a large-scale emergency response, each with a role, all working together so the response is coordinated rather than chaotic. So my advice? Align your internal practices with these EU-level initiatives. Follow ENISA's guidance, understand how CERT-EU and Tiber-EU fit the picture. Being aware of and aligned with this ecosystem keeps you connected to the broader European resilience effort, which ultimately benefits your own firm. Let's address a concern that honestly holds many firms back from sharing: the fear of confidentiality breaches. It's a completely valid worry. If you share threat intelligence, could it expose your firm or reveal that you were attacked? Good sharing frameworks have strong confidentiality protections precisely to ease this fear. Let me explain how they work. Here's the foundation. Sharing must safeguard confidential business information. The whole arrangement is built to let you share useful threat intelligence without exposing your firm's sensitive details or vulnerabilities. So, you apply controls that limit who can access the shared data, keeping it within the trusted circle we discussed. One widely used mechanism is the traffic light protocol. It's a simple, elegant system for labeling how widely information can be shared, using colors like red, amber, green, and white to signal the boundaries. Red might mean for your eyes only, while green means share freely within the community. It lets the sharer control the spread. These protections work both ways, protecting the interests of the source who shares and the recipients who receive. Everyone needs to trust that the system respects boundaries. Let me give you an analogy. Think of a journalist's confidential sources. The whole system of journalism depends on sources trusting that their identity will be protected. Without that trust, no one would ever come forward. Threat intelligence sharing relies on the same kind of trust. Protect the source, and people will keep sharing. So my advice? Understand and use these confidentiality mechanisms, like the traffic light protocol, so you can share with confidence. Because here's the bottom line. Breaches of confidentiality don't just harm one firm, they undermine the entire arrangement. When trust breaks, sharing stops. So protect it fiercely. Now let's navigate a genuinely tricky intersection. What happens when the threat intelligence you want to share contains personal data? Because suddenly, you're not just dealing with DORA's sharing provisions, you're dealing with GDPR too, and these two must coexist carefully. Let me help you walk this tightrope. Here's the heart of the issue. Threat intelligence often contains personal data without you even realizing it. Think about it. IP addresses can be personal data, email addresses used in phishing attacks, attacker details, even information about affected individuals. The moment personal data is involved, GDPR applies, full stop. It doesn't care that your intention is noble cybersecurity defense. So what do? First, you need to establish a lawful basis for sharing that personal data. GDPR requires a legitimate legal ground for any processing. Then, you apply the principle of data minimization. Only share the personal data that's genuinely necessary and anonymize wherever you possibly can. If you can strip out or mask the personal elements while keeping the threat intelligence useful, do it. Let me give you a real example I've encountered. A team wanted to share details of a malicious actor, including data that could identify individuals. The right move was to share the useful threat indicators while carefully minimizing and anonymizing the personal data, satisfying both the security goal and GDPR. And here's a crucial coordination point. Work with your DPO, your data protection officer, on this. They are the experts on the data protection risk, and they should be involved when personal data enters the sharing picture. Let's explore another legal boundary that surprises people in the context of information sharing: competition law. You might wonder, what on earth does competition law have to do with sharing cyber threats? It's a fair question, and the answer is important because if you stray across this line, you can land in serious trouble. Let me explain. Here's the concern. When competitors get together to share information, even with the best intentions, competition law gets nervous. Why? Because regulators worry that companies might use the cover of collaboration to share commercially sensitive information, things like pricing, business strategies, or market plans, which could harm fair competition. So when financial firms, who are often competitors, sit in a sharing forum together, there's a line to respect. The key principle is this. Keep your sharing focused strictly on security, not on market or commercial matters. You're there to swap threat intelligence and defensive insights. Full stop. You are absolutely not there to discuss anything commercially sensitive. Stay in your lane, and that lane is cybersecurity. This is where anonymization standards come back in, applied to outgoing disclosures. By anonymizing and focusing only on the threat data, you naturally steer clear of sharing anything that could raise competition concerns. You set clear standards for exactly what can and can't be shared. Let me use an analogy. Imagine rival restaurant owners meeting to discuss a food safety threat in their area. A bad supplier, say. That's fine. It protects everyone's customers. But if they started discussing what prices to charge, that's illegal collusion. The food safety talk is welcome. The pricing talk is forbidden. Same principle here. Let's switch to the practical side of actually using shared intelligence, starting with what comes in. Here's a problem you'll quickly discover once you join sharing communities. You get a lot of intelligence, a flood of it, and not all of it matters to you. So the skill becomes triaging that incoming intelligence wisely. Let me show you how. The challenge is real. If you treat every single piece of incoming intelligence as urgent, you'll drown, and your team will burn out chasing things that don't matter. So you need a filtering process. 3 questions guide good triage. Is it relevant to your environment? Is the source credible? And is it actionable? Can you actually do something with it? Start with relevance. Does this threat actually apply to your systems, your technology, your situation? Intelligence about a vulnerability in software you don't even use isn't worth your time. Then credibility. How reliable is the source? Not all intelligence is equally trustworthy. And actionability. Can you take a concrete step in response, or is it just vague noise? The goal is to filter out the noise and surface the signal, then route the genuinely actionable items to the right teams quickly. Let me give you an analogy. Think of a hospital emergency room doing triage. Patients flood in, and nurses rapidly sort them: who needs immediate attention, who can wait, who's not really an emergency. Without triage, the system collapses. Your intelligence intake needs that same disciplined sorting. So you've triaged your incoming intelligence and identified what genuinely matters. Now comes the step that creates real value: actually integrating that intelligence into your risk management. Because here's the thing: intelligence that just sits in someone's inbox achieves nothing. It has to feed into action. Let me explain how to close that loop. The core principle is this: threat intelligence should be a living input to your risk framework, not a separate, disconnected activity. When you learn about a new threat, it should directly inform your risk assessments. Maybe it reveals a risk you'd underrated or a new attack vector you hadn't considered. You adjust accordingly. Concretely, you update your controls and your detection rules based on the insights. Learned about a new attack technique? Update your monitoring to catch it. You might adjust your risk priorities or even your risk appetite in light of an emerging threat. And you link intelligence directly to your vulnerability management. If intelligence highlights a vulnerability being actively exploited, that shoots straight to the top of your fix list. Let me make it real. Suppose intelligence comes in that attackers are actively exploiting a specific weakness in a system you use. That changes everything. That vulnerability is no longer theoretical. It's a clear and present danger. So you prioritize patching it immediately. The intelligence drove a concrete defensive action. Think of it like a weather forecast that actually changes your plans. Hearing a storm is coming is useless if you still leave the windows open and plan a picnic. The value is in adjusting your behavior based on the forecast. We've covered receiving intelligence. Now let's flip it around to giving, preparing your own outgoing disclosures to share with the community. And this direction needs extra care because once you share something, you can't unshare it. So you want a solid process to make sure what goes out is safe, useful, and properly approved. Let me walk you through it. Here's the discipline. Before any intelligence leaves your organization, it should pass through a defined approval process. You don't want individuals freelancing, sharing whatever they like without oversight. There needs to be a checkpoint, someone who reviews and approves outgoing disclosures. What does that review check? Several things. First, anonymization. Has the personal data been stripped or masked to protect privacy and meet GDPR? Second, legal and competitive risk. Remember our competition law discussion? Does this disclosure stay safely within security topics and avoid anything sensitive? And throughout, you assign clear ownership for preparing and submitting these disclosures. So it's somebody's defined responsibility, not an afterthought. Let me give you an analogy. Think of a company's press office. An individual employee doesn't just publish whatever they want to the public. There's a review process to ensure nothing confidential, legally risky, or off-message goes out. Your outgoing intelligence deserves that same gatekeeping care. And here's a practical tip. Keep records of what you shared and with whom. This protects you and supports accountability if questions ever arise. Let's talk about turning all this shared intelligence into tangible improvements in your actual defenses, specifically your detection and your recovery capabilities. Because ultimately, the whole point of participating in sharing is to get better at protecting and recovering your firm. So let me show you how intelligence translates into real-world resilience gains. Start with detection. When you receive shared indicators, the digital fingerprints of attacks, you apply them directly to strengthen your monitoring. You feed them into your detection systems so that if those same threats come knocking at your door, you spot them instantly. You're essentially programming your defenses with knowledge of attacks that have hit others. You also update your detection and response playbooks with the new insights. Learned how a particular attack unfolds from a peer's experience? Update your playbook so your team knows exactly how to respond if it happens to you. And more broadly, you use intelligence to anticipate and preempt attacks, getting ahead of threats rather than just reacting. On the recovery side, you improve your recovery planning using real-world lessons. If shared intelligence reveals how an attack damaged another firm and how they recovered, you can refine your own recovery procedures accordingly. You learn from their pain without having to suffer it yourself. Let me give you a real flavor. Imagine a peer firm shares that a certain ransomware strain specifically targets backups in a particular way. You immediately check and harden your own backup protections against exactly that tactic. Their experience just made you measurably more resilient. Let's address an important coordination challenge: how information sharing connects with your incident reporting obligations from Chapter 3. Because these two activities can overlap and interact, and if you're not careful, they can create confusion or even conflict. So let me help you keep them properly aligned. Here's the key distinction to hold clearly in your mind. Information sharing under Article 45 is largely voluntary, collaborative threat intelligence exchange. Incident reporting under DORA's incident rules is mandatory regulatory notification when a major incident hits. They are different activities with different purposes, even though both involve communicating about cyber events. So how do they connect? Well, shared intelligence can actually support your incident response, giving you context and insights that help you handle and report an incident better. But you need to coordinate the timing across both activities and, crucially, avoid conflicts between sharing and your confidentiality duties. For instance, during a live incident, you must be careful about what you share externally versus what goes formally to the regulator. Let me illustrate. Suppose you're hit by an attack. You have a mandatory reporting obligation to your regulator that's non-negotiable and follows the strict timelines. Separately, you might choose to share threat indicators about the attack with your community to help others. Both can happen, but they are distinct channels with distinct rules, and you shouldn't let the voluntary sharing interfere with or compromise the mandatory reporting. Think of it like a doctor who must report a notifiable disease to health authorities. That's mandatory, while also choosing to share research insights with colleagues. That's collaborative. Both valuable, but governed differently. Let's close this chapter by elevating information sharing from an operational activity to a strategic one, by talking about benchmarking your maturity and reporting to the board. Because here's a question worth asking. How do you actually know if your firm is good at information sharing? And how do you show that to leadership? Let me explain. Start with benchmarking. You assess your sharing participation against your peers and against DORA's expectations. Are you actively engaged or just nominally a member of a group you never really use? You define maturity measures for your intelligence capability, looking at things like how well you consume incoming intelligence, how reliably you contribute, and how effectively you turn intelligence into action. This honest self-assessment reveals where you stand. Then comes board reporting. You report your sharing activities and, importantly, their value to the board. Now, this matters because leadership needs to see that information sharing isn't just a cost or a nice to have. It delivers real resilience benefits. You highlight the threats you caught early thanks to sharing, the improvements you made, the gaps you've identified. Let me frame it with an analogy. Think of a fitness tracker. It doesn't just say you exercised, it benchmarks your progress, shows trends, and helps you see whether you're improving or slipping. Benchmarking your sharing maturity does the same. It turns a vague "yes, we share" into a clear picture of capability and progress. And here's the strategic link. You tie your sharing maturity to your overall resilience objectives. Information sharing isn't a standalone hobby. It's part of how your firm stays resilient.